Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to Victorian England. A world of corsets, calling cards, and courtship rules so strict they'd make a modern dating app blush. You're there too, tucked uncomfortably into a drawing room chair that isn't built for lounging, surrounded by oil paintings that judge you silently. Outside, the rain taps like a polite suitor against the parlor window. And somewhere nearby, a maid is brewing a tea that's far too weak for your current emotional needs. Because tonight you're not just visiting, you're courting. And every move, every glance, every gloved hand matters. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are? Post it in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your gloves are on, which means you're in public. You're available for observation, and your hands, those traitorous things that might otherwise betray affection, are safely wrapped in soft, socially acceptable denial. In Victorian England, courtship wasn't a dialogue. It was a ballet of unspoken cues, and your gloves, they're more than fashion. They're armor, protocol, and occasionally code. Let's be clear, removing one glove during a visit could mean warmth. Removing both might be forward. Not removing them at all could mean you're either deeply proper or just incredibly sweaty. And, God help you, if someone catches you slipping a glove back on in the wrong context. You might as well propose to a chimney sweep. Your hands stay firmly covered today. You're visiting the parlor of the Everleigh family. Good reputation, decent fortune, 2 daughters, and a harpsichord that hasn't been in tune since Waterloo. You're here to observe, to maybe converse, and above all, to behave. Your presence has been vetted, your coat freshly brushed, and you've practiced 3 safe conversation starters. The weather, the merits of Queen Victoria's latest portrait, and whether plum is an appropriate autumn waistcoat color. Trick question. It always is, if you're rich enough. Mainstream fact. In the Victorian era, social visits, especially between unmarried men and women, were governed by strict etiquette. Gloves were worn at nearly all times in public. Removing them was only appropriate in highly specific situations, often dependent on the hostess's home, the guest's relationship status, and even the time of day. You sit posture erect, spine protesting. Across the room, Miss Margaret Everleigh sits beside her needlepoint, eyes lowered but just slightly. Not enough to be rude, just enough to suggest mystery. Her sister, the younger and more mischievous Emily, is pretending to tune the harpsichord, though you suspect she's eavesdropping with great interest. The mother offers tea. You nod. Sugar. Yes. Milk. Of course. You've now said more to Mrs. Everleigh in 30 seconds than you're technically allowed to say to her daughters in a full afternoon. This is normal. You sip carefully, pinky tilted slightly, not too much, or you'll look affected, but not too little or you'll look like a stable boy. You are walking a tightrope of teacups and gloved fingers. Now to speak. You glance toward Margaret, a cough, a gentle one. Miss Everly, I noticed the chrysanthemums in your garden. You have no idea what chrysanthemums are. You're not even sure they were chrysanthemums. She nods, demurely. They've taken well to the soil this year. Her voice is soft but firm, like linen, soaked in vinegar. She is giving you just enough to respond, but not enough to invite anything scandalous, like conversation. You nod. Again, you're both brilliant at this. Quirky tidbit. In certain households, women were expected to embroider during visits, not for utility, but to demonstrate patience, gentleness, and industrious femininity. If she stitched with her head turned toward you, it was considered a polite sign of interest. If she faced away, the thread might as well be a wall. And now disaster. A glove slip, not yours, hers. Margaret adjusts her wrist and the glove's edge rides up slightly, exposing a single centimeter of bare wrist. It might as well be scandalous. You look away, eyes firmly fixed on a nearby table lamp, which depicts a cherub so unsettling it seems to judge you in real time. But your pulse quickens, because this might mean something, or it might mean her gloves are just ill-fitted. You'll never know. That's the game. Historians still argue whether courtship in the Victorian era was more restrictive than romantic, or whether its rigid rules created a subtler, deeper intimacy. After all, when you're not allowed to touch, every breath is a message. Every glance is a novel. You're living this now, and frankly, it's exhausting. You rise at the designated time, exactly 23 minutes into the visit, long enough to be polite, short enough to avoid gossip. You bow to Mrs. Everly. You nod at Emily. You glance at Margaret, but not too long. Outside, the air is cool, your lungs grateful for space. You survived. No feelings were spilled. No rules were broken. And somewhere beneath the silence and the stiff formality, you think something passed between you and Margaret. A glance, a half smile, a gloved moment. Or maybe not. Maybe it was just tea. But tomorrow you'll be back with cleaner gloves and maybe a better flower name. You return the next day. Of course you do, because in Victorian England, playing hard to get isn't just advice, it's law. You can't write. You can't flirt openly. You can't confess a thing, but you can show up at the same house at exactly the same time. And if anyone notices, you say you're returning a handkerchief, even if it was never yours to begin with. Today you arrive a minute earlier than yesterday. On purpose, you'll deny it. You're ushered into the same parlor, same armchairs, same slightly alarming cherub lamp, same faint scent of beeswax and lavender that somehow feels judgmental. But today the energy is different, because today it's just you and the Everly sisters. Mrs. Everly has taken a mysterious rest upstairs, which might be true, or it might be Victorian code for I'm watching through the floorboards. One never knows. You sit carefully. Margaret glances up from her embroidery red silk thread. on cream linen. It's a rose, perhaps, or maybe a bleeding heart. You can't tell yet. Emily, bless her, pretends to examine the bookshelf. She's 17, which means she's bursting with mischief, but can't legally do anything about it yet. You nod. Again. Parlor nods are their own language. Margaret offers a polite smile. You mention the weather, the light frost last night. She agrees. Then adds that the frost did no damage to the chrysanthemums. She remembers. You relax by 2%. Progress. Victorian courtship is a minefield, and the parlor is where most hearts either take flight or spontaneously combust under the pressure of too much tea and too little privacy. You know this room is more than just floral wallpaper and dusty upholstery. It's a stage, a test, a velvet interrogation chamber. This is where reputations are weighed, fortunes hinted at, future in-laws silently judged. This is where people fall in love and don't even know it until it's too late to say anything without causing scandal. And you are in the thick of it. Mainstream fact. In Victorian upper and middle-class homes, the parlor was the primary space for courtship. Unlike today's private texting and one-on-one dinners, courtship interactions happened in highly supervised public or semi-private spaces with family always nearby. Today, something odd happens. Margaret speaks first. Have you read Mr. Tennyson's new poem, You Nearly Choke on Your Tea? She's initiated literary discourse, a high-risk maneuver comparable to making eye contact for more than 4 seconds. You recover quickly and nod. You haven't read it. Of course you haven't. You haven't read anything since your last outing to the tailor, and that was just coat patterns. But you bluff with grace. His use of meter is always compelling, you say. She tilts her head. A test. You scramble. Particularly how he lingers on grief. There's a musicality to it, even when it's heavy. A pause. Then she nods. You live to see another tea refill. And now, the parlor standoff. No one speaks. Emily is still pretending to examine the bookshelf, though her eyes haven't moved past the history of railcar development in 12 minutes. Margaret stitches. You pretend not to watch the way the sunlight touches her hair, just barely catching on the few loose strands her bonnet can't tame. And then, the sound. Footsteps. Multiple. Male. You stiffen. 2 more gentlemen arrive. The Collins brothers. Local. Slightly wealthier than you. Known for hunting and wearing jackets that are always a little too vibrant. They bow. You nod. Margaret stands politely, as is custom. You suddenly feel like a badly parked carriage, awkward, unnecessary, blocking the view. They take seats opposite you. The one with the mustard-colored waistcoat begins to speak immediately about hunting dogs, because of course he does. You sip tea. Margaret listens. Emily's eyes sparkle. She loves chaos. You fight the urge to check your glove for emotional leaks. Quirky tidbit. In upper-class Victorian households, a young woman could entertain multiple suitors, but only one at a time per day. Hosting more than one gentleman caller in the same afternoon was considered forward and possibly the beginning of a family scandal. You stay calm because you've read exactly how to survive this. If another suitor arrives during your visit and the hostess allows him in, it's a test. If the lady continues to engage you while the newcomer speaks, it's a sign of preference. Margaret turns to you. Did you say you prefer chrysanthemums over camellias? The Collins brothers go quiet for a fraction of a second. Victory. Small, quiet, gloved. But victory nonetheless. You smile. I find them more resilient, less decorative, more substance. She nods. Another stitch in the bleeding heart. You don't know if she means to be this subtle or if you're imagining everything. But either way, your pulse is no longer governed by logic. It's governed by gloves and glances and Victorian poetry references. Historians still argue whether women in the Victorian era had genuine agency in choosing their suitors, or if it was mostly parental negotiation with bonus embroidery. But in this moment, watching Margaret stitch a crimson flower as she asks your opinion on winter gardens, while ignoring two men who smell faintly of horse leather and ego, you think, yes, she knows what she's doing, and yes, she's choosing. Eventually, you stand. You've overstayed by 4 minutes. Unforgivable in theory, adorable in practice. Margaret doesn't walk you out, never do that, but she does rise when you do, which is enough. The Collins boys stay seated. You bow. She nods. Emily finally looks at something besides train books. And you step back into the cold London air, wondering how a parlor, 3 cups of tea, and a needlepoint flower can feel more intimate than anything else in your entire life. You smile, and you plan your next visit, maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after, depending, of course, on glove availability. The next day, you do not call, because not calling is, in fact, the appropriate thing to do. You mustn't appear too eager, too available, or, heaven forbid, romantic. This is not a Shakespearean balcony scene. This is Victorian England. Timing is everything. And according to the rules of courtship, visiting a young lady 2 days in a row, uninvited, signals a lack of self-control, social grace, and possibly sound financial planning. So, you wait. But of course, you don't just wait. You prepare. You sit at your writing desk, calling cards stacked in perfect alignment, and you think deeply about the angle of the left corner. If you bend it just slightly, it means you came by in person. If you leave it flat, it could suggest the card was delivered by a servant. Both are technically correct, but one says interested gentleman, the other says ambitious cousin. You choose the corner bend. You walk to the Everly house just before tea. You do not knock. You hand the card to the maid and leave without a word. She knows what it means. So do they. Now, all you can do is wait. Again. You return the following day, this time at the exact minute the sun begins to cast light across the Everly's front windows. It is a warm gold like melted honey, and for a moment you allow yourself to believe in omens. You are let in without fuss. Mrs. Everly is downstairs again, sipping weak chamomile and commenting on the decline of piano quality. You nod. She nods. There is, as always, mutual understanding in the fact that neither of you cares for music. Then Margaret enters. She wears pale blue today, with a brooch shaped like a swallow, a subtle symbol, but in Victorian flower and fauna language, the swallow represents loyalty and a safe return. You do not overanalyze this. You simply note it, quietly, internally, frantically. Emily is not in the room. You try not to panic. Mainstream fact. Calling cards were a cornerstone of Victorian social etiquette. They conveyed not only one's presence, but also subtle messages through physical alterations. Bent corners, ink color, and even decorative elements carried nuanced meanings. A gentleman's card, well placed, could initiate an entire romantic chain reaction. You sit, and Margaret sits opposite. This is bold. Usually, a third party would be present to reduce temptation. Perhaps Emily is meant to be here, and her absence is a test, or worse, a trap. Still, you proceed with caution. Margaret speaks first. Do you know the language of flowers? Your heart skips a beat. This is code. All of it is code. You reply measured, only enough to confuse a lily with a calla. She smiles. Then, I've always liked snowdrops. Another test. You scramble mentally. Snowdrops eos hope, or rebirth, or fragile resilience, depending on the volume you consult. You take a chance. They bloom in the cold, don't they? She nods. Yes, they're brave. You sip tea to hide the way your hands tremble. And now comes the game. Not chess, not cards. Conversation. Unscripted, fragile, and layered, like a millefeuille of social consequences. You ask about her stitching. She's nearly done with the bleeding heart pattern. She laughs softly and admits she didn't know that was the name of the flower when she chose it. You both know that's a lie. Then she asks about your family. You tread lightly. Respectable, you say. Predictable. Fond of oranges. She blinks. Oranges. You nod. My uncle imports them. Claims it's more romantic than banking. She laughs genuinely, and now you know she wanted to laugh. She needed permission. So, you give her more. You mention how you once spilled ink on your waistcoat, trying to mimic Tennyson's cursive. You describe the awful poetry you wrote at 15, and how your mother pretended it was brilliant. Margaret smiles again. Did she frame it? She threatened to. That one earns a proper laugh, one that startles the teacups. Progress, quirky tidbit. Victorians were obsessed with coded communication. Flowers fans, gloves even. How one folded a letter could carry hidden meaning. A woman placing a teacup down firmly might be signaling irritation, while gently brushing crumbs off a sleeve could indicate romantic interest. It was all maddeningly indirect and meticulously documented in etiquette manuals. Margaret folds her hands now, a quiet signal. She is ready for silence. You respect it. The clock ticks once, then twice. No one moves. And then, thank heaven, Emily bursts through the door with all the chaos of a small storm dressed in ruffles. Mr. Collins sent another bouquet, she announces dramatically. Margaret's eyes flicker toward you. You do not flinch. Emily plops into the settee with theatrical flair. It's mostly roses, red, so obvious you smile faintly. Margaret does not look at you, but she also does not deny the gift. Emily sips tea with the expression of someone who has chosen to become the audience. You decide to make your exit. You rise slowly, gloves in hand. Margaret stands too. Mrs. Everly enters at that moment as if summoned by invisible protocol. You all bow, nod, curtsy, and you leave. But this time, Margaret walks you to the door. Not far, just 3 steps. And at the threshold, where the light hits the floor like a spotlight on an unscripted moment, she speaks. Perhaps next time you could bring a snowdrop. Your heart is not prepared. You nod barely, and then you walk away. You do not look back. You never look back, because that's not what a gentleman does, even when he desperately wants to. Historians still argue whether Victorian women truly controlled their romantic choices, or if they simply mastered the art of subtle resistance within rigid rules. But as you walk away with your pulse hammering and your gloves damp from nervous hands, you think, yes, they held the cards. They just pretended not to deal them. Later that night, you sit with your ink and your notebook. You draw a snowdrop, terribly. Then try again. You fold the page once carefully, not diagonally, too forward. And you think, tomorrow. You will bring it tomorrow. Folded, unspoken, but present, just like hope. Morning in London arrives with a crisp gray light that slips through chimney smoke and fog like it's sneaking into your thoughts. You don't sleep well, not because of noise or discomfort, but because you've spent most of the night staring at a poorly drawn snowdrop, wondering if it looks more like a turnip. It does. But it's earnest, and maybe that's enough. You dress carefully. Gloves, of course. Cravat loosely knotted with an air of casual dignity. You're trying to look effortless, which takes nearly an hour. You carry the sketch folded once and slipped into your coat pocket, not as a letter, not as a gift, but as a symbol. If anyone asks, you're returning a book. No one will ask. They never do. But you need an excuse, even if it's just for yourself. The Everly house looks exactly the same as it did yesterday and the day before. The ivy on the gate is still drooping slightly over the brick, and the front step creaks faintly as you approach. You feel like you're stepping into a ritual, more than a building. You hand your card to the maid again. This time she smiles and says, Miss Everly is in the garden. A heartbeat, not the parlor, not under the watchful cherub lamp. The garden, mainstream fact. A garden invitation was a major shift in Victorian courtship. While parlors were formal and supervised, gardens allowed for more casual interaction, still chaperoned, but less rigid. In etiquette terms, this implied growing comfort and potential approval by the family. You follow the maid around the side of the house, past rows of hedges, trimmed within an inch of their lives, and enter the garden from the east. The sun is just warming the ground, and the chrysanthemums, yes, you can name them, now catch the light like soft flames. Margaret is there. She wears a hat with a ribbon the color of ash, and her gloves are off. That detail hits you like a violin string, pulled just a little too tight. You aren't sure what to do with it. She's holding a trowel, real dirt on real hands. It's the most human thing you've seen in 3 days. You walk slowly. She looks up, smiles, no pretense this time. I thought you might come. You reach into your coat pocket and offer her the folded page. You say nothing. She opens it carefully. The drawing is bad. Really bad. She doesn't laugh. Instead, she turns it toward the light, studies it like it's an artifact, and says, "It looks brave." Your heart stumbles over itself. There's a bench in the garden. You both sit far enough apart for propriety, but close enough that your shadows touch. That's progress. Victorian romance is mostly shadows anyway. You talk about her favorite colors, deep green and dusty pink, about your least favorite social event, musical recitals, especially when someone insists on singing. She asks you what you wanted to be as a child. You lie gently. A sea captain. She doesn't believe you. You both laugh. Quirky tidbit. Many Victorian children dreamed of becoming explorers or officers, but social class usually dictated more predictable careers: clergy, civil service, or managing family property. Admitting artistic or adventurous ambition was rare and seen as slightly scandalous unless accompanied by money. She tells you about a novel she's reading under her bed covers because her mother thinks it's overly French. You guess correctly, Madame Bovary. She looks at you sideways when you say it. Emily eventually appears, a basket in hand, feigning surprise. "Oh, I didn't realize anyone was in the garden." You both pretend to believe her. She wanders near the rose bushes and hums a melody far too loudly to be casual. Still, Margaret stays seated. So do you, for once. Time bends around you. There is no teacup to watch, no clock to obey, no gloves to adjust nervously. Just the sound of birds, the scent of moist soil, and a pair of ruined boots you regret not polishing. At one point, Margaret reaches for a small snowdrop blooming in a shady patch near the wall. She doesn't pick it. She just points. There, a proper one. You smile. Better than mine. She says nothing, but doesn't disagree. Historians still argue whether moments like this were common or cinematic, whether true intimacy could form in the gaps between rules, or if we simply romanticize their restraint to make our own chaos seem more poetic. You aren't sure, but you do know you're not cold anymore. And your gloves still in your lap, still untouched. Eventually, the clouds shift, and Emily declares she's suddenly quite hungry, which is code for your time is up. You nod slowly. Margaret stands. You rise too. She doesn't walk you to the gate. Gardens are freer, but not that free. Instead, she says, "Thank you for the drawing." You nod. "I'll try again next week." Her smile is small, but it reaches her eyes. Try a camellia next. Your breath catches. That's not just a suggestion. That's an invitation to return. And in Victorian courtship, an invitation to return is more than affection. It's hope in pressed petals and bent paper. You walk back through the garden path, careful not to crush any flowers. You're not just avoiding mud. You're preserving memory. Because in a world of silence and ceremony, every step is part of the message. And you want yours to say, I heard you. I saw the snowdrop, and I'll be back with ink and nerve and maybe, just maybe, a better camellia. Camellias are deceptively difficult to draw. You learn this the hard way by smudging 3 sheets of cream paper with charcoal and ink, producing what looks less like a flower and more like a startled cabbage. But you're determined, because Margaret asked for a camellia, not just any flower, that one, and you know what it means. You finally settle on an imperfect but passable sketch. 5 rounded petals, shaded, to suggest softness, and a stem that's only slightly crooked. You don't color it in. Somehow the blankness feels more honest, or at least less embarrassing. This time you don't fold it. You place it inside a slim envelope and seal it with a touch of wax. No crest, no initials, just plain translucent red. The kind that implies intention without screaming it. You don't write a note. That would be too forward. Besides, if she's half as clever as she seems, and she is, she'll understand. You bring it to the Everleys' front door at precisely 3:12 p.m., just late enough to seem casual, just early enough to appear thoughtful. The maid takes it with a neutral face, which in Victorian England means wild excitement, concealed beneath 1,000 layers of domestic stoicism. You walk away quickly, because you are, as usual, terrified. The next morning, you receive a note, folded twice, left at your door. It contains exactly 3 words, written in the neatest, most deliberate script you've ever seen. Try hydrangea next. Mainstream fact. In the Victorian language of flowers, camellias symbolized admiration and longing, especially in the color white. Hydrangeas, on the other hand, were more ambiguous. They could mean heartfelt emotion or frigidity and vanity, depending on context. So, naturally, they were a favorite in flirty garden politics. You spend the next 2 days in a state of half-suspended animation. You go about your business, visiting the bookseller, nodding politely at your aunt's complaints about vinegar pricing. But your mind keeps returning to hydrangeas. Was it an invitation? A challenge? A joke? A gentle rebuff? You try sketching one. It looks like a cauliflower wearing a wig. You give up. This time you decide to bring a real one. You stop by the market, locate a modest bouquet of pale blue hydrangeas, and trim the stems yourself. Not too neat. A little wild, a little romantic, but not too romantic. You tie them with a strip of linen, not ribbon. Ribbon would imply too much. You hold the bouquet like it might explode, and once again you find yourself standing outside the Everleigh's door. This time, Margaret answers. Not the maid. Not Emily. Margaret. She steps outside as if this is a completely ordinary thing, as though she's not breaking 17 silent rules of etiquette in broad daylight. She sees the flowers. She smiles. And for the first time since you met her, she does not speak first. You offer them in both hands. Hydrangeas, you say. I think they mean gratitude, she interrupts. You pause. That too. She takes them carefully. Her fingers brush yours. And for a second, just a second, the air between you is electric, with every unsaid word that can't fit into the language of flowers. She looks over her shoulder, then says, "Come to the park this Saturday, at noon." You blink. Alone. She raises an eyebrow. With Emily. You smile. You've never liked chaperones more. Quirky tidbit. While public parks in Victorian England were technically acceptable places for socializing, they were also cleverly used for stolen moments of flirtation. Walking in a park allowed a couple to accidentally linger behind the group, especially if the chaperone was distracted by a swan or an ice cream vendor. Saturday arrives. You wear your least wrinkled coat and try to tame your hair, which refuses. You carry no drawing, no flowers, just gloves and nerves. You find them near the duck pond. Emily is feeding birds with exaggerated joy. Margaret waves you over. No introductions, no tea, just walking. You stroll slowly along the gravel path, crunching fallen leaves and dodging eager children with hoops. Emily drifts ahead, half-heartedly pursuing a duck. Margaret walks beside you. She says, "Thank you for the camellia." You nod. She adds, "And for not coloring it in." You glance at her. She's not looking at you, which means it matters. You say, "I didn't want to ruin it." That's the secret, she replies, isn't it? Knowing when to stop before you ruin it. You think she's talking about the drawing. You know she's not. Historians still argue whether Victorian courtship rules preserved romance or prevented it, whether all this formality heightened emotions or suffocated them. But as you walk side by side with a woman who once couldn't even shake your hand and now talks about ruin, like it's a shared language, you think maybe it's both. Maybe that's the point, to feel everything, say nothing, and somehow still be understood. You reach the far end of the park, where the trees begin to thin, and the noise of carriages fade. Emily is seated on a bench, nose deep in a penny novel, probably something with pirates. Margaret stops. "So you stop too." She looks at you, not sideways, not through the corner of a bonnet. Straight. "I don't like roses," she says. You nod. "They're too loud," she adds. "I know you don't. But you do now. You don't touch her hand. But you want to. You don't ask to see her tomorrow. But you hope she'll ask you. She doesn't. Instead, she says, "I'm glad you're not like the others." You smile and answer, "I still might ruin the next flower." "That's all right," she says. They grow back. And with that, she turns to Emily, who pretends not to have heard a thing, and the three of you walk back toward the crowd, slowly, silently, and full of everything Victorian society doesn't allow, but can't quite extinguish. Not yet. Not today. You've started measuring your days by flowers now. Monday was camellia. Wednesday was hydrangea. Today might be lavender. You aren't sure. Margaret didn't say. She hasn't sent a note, no folded instruction, no cryptic botanical riddle. But the last thing she said, they grow back echoes in your chest like a whispered dare. So you do something unthinkable. You decide on the flower yourself. Lavender. Not because you know what it means. You don't, not exactly. But because it smells like calm and looks like restraint. And that seems about right. You choose a modest sprig, tuck it inside a book of Psalms, you pretend to be reading, and carry it like a secret. When you arrive at the Everleys, the maid lets you in without a word. There's no parlor today. You're sent to the greenhouse. This is new. This is big. Mainstream fact. In upper-middle-class Victorian homes, greenhouses were not just plant nurseries, they were quiet sanctuaries. A woman inviting a gentleman into her family's greenhouse, even with a chaperone nearby, was offering something rare shared peace. It was seen as deeply personal, almost private. Margaret is kneeling beside a tray of seedlings, her dress hitched just above her ankles, a minor scandal made tender by the fact that no one is looking but you. Her hands are stained with soil, not dainty like embroidery, real work, earth under her nails. This feels like truth. You hesitate in the doorway. She doesn't look up. You're late. You glance at the clock on the wall. You're actually early. You say, your definition of time is unforgiving. She brushes her hands on a cloth. My time is unforgiving. You pause. She smirks. You both laugh. It's not a good joke, but it is yours. You walk over and kneel beside her, ignoring the awkward press of gravel against your knees. You place the lavender gently beside her tray. She doesn't touch it. Instead, she nods at a small potted sprig in front of her. Is that for me? You look closer. It's not lavender. It's rue. You blink. She says, do you know what it means? You shake your head. She wipes sweat from her brow. Regret. Then she picks up your lavender and says almost in a whisper, and this, you try to remember. You fail. So you guess. Calm devotion, she corrects. Or mistrust, depends who's asking. She doesn't say which she means, and you don't ask. Quirky tidbit Victorian florography included not just species, but color and context. Lavender's dual meanings. Devotion and mistrust made it popular in ambiguous courtships. Paired with rue, it often symbolized bittersweet memory or forgiveness. It was the literary version of a sigh. You sit in silence. The greenhouse hums around you. Bees tapping glass, leaves shifting against pots. Somewhere nearby, a kettle whistles, though no one moves to claim it. Margaret is the first to speak. My cousin thinks we're improper. You tilt your head. Are we? She shrugs. Less than some more than others. You consider that. Then say, tell her we only ever talk about plants. Margaret raises an eyebrow. Is that what this is? You glance at the lavender. Yes. No, she replies softly. And again, you don't ask for clarity, because clarity ruins things like this. Instead, you pick up the small wooden stake beside the rue and write her name on it. Not Miss Everly, just Margaret. She watches you. You place it in the soil next to the rue and whisper, so you remember what you planted. She smiles, almost sadly. Maybe it's best if I forget. You look at her. Do you want to forget? She doesn't answer, which is, of course, an answer. Historians still argue whether love in the Victorian era was ever real or simply a well-rehearsed performance in corsets and carefully folded napkins. But here, kneeling in a room full of humidity and unsaid things, you begin to believe it was real. It just had to work harder to survive the rules. A noise at the door. Emily, carrying a tray of tea and a look that says she knows exactly what you're doing, even if no one else does. She sets the tray down and says, "The lilies are wilting." Margaret stands brushing soil from her skirt. Everything wilts. Emily shrugs. Some things bloom again. And then, with a look at you that is somehow both warning and blessing, she adds, "Tea." You sip in silence. Margaret takes hers with 2 sugars, no cream. You file that away like a map. When you leave, there are no goodbyes, just a small square of folded linen in your pocket. Pressed inside, 1 sprig of lavender, 1 leaf of rue, no name, no message. Just a memory, scented like quiet. You walk home under a thickening sky. Rain threatens, but never falls. You think about rue, about regret. You think about how devotion and mistrust can live side by side in the same flower. You wonder which one Margaret meant and whether it matters. Because right now the scent on your fingertips is soft and bitter and still warm. And that maybe is enough. Rain finally comes. Not the theatrical downpour of novels, but a steady gray drizzle that soaks the edges of your sleeves and blurs the pavement. It's the kind of weather that makes London feel smaller, quieter somehow. Horse hooves, muffled footsteps cautious. Umbrellas bloom like cautious petals along the street. You don't bring one, not because you forgot, but because you hope to look romantic. Ridiculous, probably. But Margaret once said, umbrellas are cowardly, and that has lingered with you, folding itself into your choices like starch into a collar. So, you let the rain hit your shoulders and pretend it means something. It's Tuesday now, and you haven't seen her since the greenhouse. No note, no card, no plant pun. You walk to the park anyway, just in case. She's not there, but Emily is. That surprises you more than it should. She's standing beneath a wrought iron arch, pretending to admire a goose sculpture. It's not a good sculpture. Even the goose looks unimpressed. Emily doesn't turn when you approach. She simply says, "She's not angry." You blink. I didn't say she was. Emily finally looks at you, but you're worried. You don't reply. She continues. She doesn't know what she wants. You nod. That makes 2 of us. Emily exhales. She's used to men being either too loud or too frightened. You're neither. You smile thinly, flattering. She shrugs. Unsettling. Mainstream fact. In Victorian courtship, siblings, especially younger sisters, often played informal gatekeepers. They could observe and report chaperone and sabotage, or sometimes, like Emily, serve as the bridge between awkward affection and actual decisions. You ask, "Why are you telling me this?" Emily tilts her head. "Because I don't want her to marry Mr. Rowe." You freeze. Ah, so that's the name. Margaret's other option. The man with the waistcoat too tight and the laugh that sounds like tea sloshing in a shallow cup. You've never met him, but you already dislike him. You say, "I don't think I'm a better option." Emily gives a crooked smile. "No, but you're real." You walk together toward the edge of the park. A light wind rattles the trees. Children chase ducks in the distance. Somewhere a dog barks once decisively, then regrets it. Emily stops near the willow tree, where you once lingered behind the group. "She'll be at the conservatory tomorrow," she says, "with the violets." Then she turns and leaves without waiting for your reply. You stand there, dripping, ridiculous, hopeful. You do not sleep that night. Not well. Not long. Your mind keeps returning to violets, to rue, to lavender. You open your old herbarium book and scan the pages like a priest looking for signs in Scripture. Violet's modesty, faithfulness, and hidden love. You close the book. Breathe. You iron your shirt twice the next morning, polish your boots until your face reflects back blurred and nervous. And then, without gloves, without umbrella, and with no bouquet, you walk to the conservatory. It smells of moss and humidity. Glass panes fog slightly at the edges, catching early sunlight like secrets. Margaret stands near the back, hands behind her. There's no chaperone. You hesitate. She speaks first. "Did Emily warn you?" You nod. "She meddles," Margaret says, "but not cruelly." You approach slowly. There's a small bench tucked beside a cluster of ferns. She gestures. You sit, not too close, but not as far as last time. Quirky tidbit conservatories in Victorian England were considered semi-public, semi-private spaces. They were used for both entertainment and introspection, and often hosted the most whispered conversations of any estate. Margaret looks at you without speaking. The silence is not awkward. It's heavy, loaded, like a letter you've sealed but not yet delivered. Then she says, "Do you know what violets mean?" You nod. Yes. She raises an eyebrow. All of it. You inhale. Modesty, loyalty, hidden things. She smiles faintly. Mostly the last one. You both look at the violets growing along the trellis. Their petals, small and curved inward, like they're protecting something fragile. You ask, "Are you hiding?" She doesn't answer right away. Then I'm trying not to be. You want to take her hand. You don't. Instead you say, "Me too." A pause. Then unexpectedly she laughs. Not the polite kind, the startled kind. Real, brief. I drew a flower for you, she says. That stuns you. She reaches into her coat and pulls out a folded piece of parchment. You take it. Inside is a simple sketch, just pencil. A lavender sprig, not perfect, but recognizable. She says I didn't shade it. Didn't want to ruin it. Your throat tightens. It's the closest thing to a confession you've ever received, and possibly ever will. Historians still argue whether romantic gestures in the Victorian era were truly romantic, or just desperate attempts to say what words couldn't, whether gifting a flower was passion or simply permission, whether all this effort was brave or afraid. You don't care, because right now she's looking at you like maybe she isn't hiding anymore, and maybe you aren't either. You stand. She stands too. The violets around you tremble in the breeze. You say, I'll see you again. She nods. Tomorrow. Then she adds, and brings something besides lavender. You smile and walk out of the conservatory with the sketch in your pocket and the quiet certainty that tomorrow may not need flowers at all. Just honesty and maybe a seat beside the violets. You bring tulips, bright yellow ones the color of warm butter or overconfident sunrises. You're not entirely sure what they mean, but they feel like hope, like something that doesn't apologize for being cheerful. Margaret doesn't comment when you offer them, just raises a brow in amusement and places them in a vase without ceremony. There's no joke, no pun, no challenge, just a smile that lingers longer than usual. You think it's a good sign. You sit on the same bench, near the violets. Margaret's skirts brush the edge of your coat, but neither of you moves. The greenhouse is quiet today. Emily is conspicuously absent, which means this is a test, or a gift, or both. Margaret speaks first. Tulips are forward, you know. You feign innocence. Are they? They're loud, bold, Dutch. You grin. So am I. She chuckles softly like it surprised her. They mean declaration of love. Yellow ones used to mean hopelessness, but they've changed. Now people say they mean cheerfulness. You tilt your head. I like both meanings. She nods. You would. Mainstream fact. Tulips were once so prized in Europe that they sparked an actual economic bubble, tulip mania, in 17th century Holland. By Victorian times, they still held prestige, but their meanings evolved with colors like yellow, shifting from jealousy to joy. You talk about trivial things, the way the hedgehog in her garden keeps overturning flower pots, how her cousin insists on playing the pianoforte despite having no discernible rhythm. You find comfort in the casualness of it. There's no grand gesture today, just presence. Eventually, she grows quiet. You follow suit. Then she says, "My father wants me to marry Ro." You don't respond right away. She continues, "It's not arranged, not like India or something. But there are expectations. alignments, polite handshakes over dinner, that sort of thing. You nod slowly. And what do you want? Margaret exhales. I want to grow things. I want to write letters without rereading them 5 times. I want to laugh without being reminded to lower my voice. You look at her and very gently ask, do you want me? She doesn't look at you, but she doesn't look away either. I don't know, she says so quietly, it could be mistaken for the sound of a leaf shifting, but I don't not want you. Quirky tidbit Victorian etiquette manuals often advised women to avoid over-familiar tone or warmth of countenance when around suitors. Basically, don't look too interested, even if you are. Especially if you are. The moment stretches. You don't press it. Instead, you say, I can bring violets again tomorrow. Margaret finally meets your gaze. No, she says. Then bring something stubborn. You raise a brow. Stubborn. She nods. Something that takes root in rocky places. That doesn't ask permission. You smile. Thistle. She nods again. You can't tell if she's joking, and you like that. The next morning you steal a thistle from the edge of a walking path. It's not elegant. It's defensive, spiky, possibly illegal. It pricks your thumb when you wrap it in linen. You bleed a little. You do not mind. At the conservatory, Margaret waits by the citrus trees. You hold out the thistle. She looks at it, then at your thumb, then says, good. She places it into a jar of water beside the violets. It doesn't belong here, she murmurs, but that's what makes it matter. You nod. I know the feeling. She laughs just once. I'm leaving for the coast in 2 days. Your breath catches. With your family. She shakes her head. With Emily. You pause. For how long? A fortnight. You do math in your head. A fortnight is long enough for someone to forget a feeling, but short enough for it to haunt you if you don't say anything before they go. You ask, can I write to you? Margaret hesitates, then says, yes. You blink. She adds, but I may not reply. You nod. That's fair. Historians still argue whether the Victorian obsession with restraint made love more powerful or more painful, whether absence really made the heart grow fonder or simply quieter. You decide it depends on the letter. You walk her home after that. For the first time you offer your arm. For the first time she takes it. No one says anything on the way, not even the wind. At her door, she turns. You'll bring something stubborn again, won't you? You nod. I'll bring a rock garden if I have to. She laughs, then says, I'll miss that. And then she's gone. Not dramatic, not teary, just gone, like a thistle in autumn, but not forgotten. Not this time. The days without Margaret are quieter. You still visit the conservatory, even though it feels wrong without her. The violets begin to wilt. The tulips droop, despite your best attempts to replace the water. The thistle, of course, remains stubborn, defiant. It hasn't bloomed further, but it also hasn't died. It becomes your companion. You talk to it sometimes, not out loud, just in your head. Silly things, like, she laughed right here and I should have asked if she liked marmalade. The thistle never replies, but that's fine. You're not expecting answers. You're practicing the art of absence. Emily sends a note on the fourth day. Coast is wet. Margaret reads a lot. Mood variable. Letter may or may not come. Don't be stupid. You smile at the last line. You take it as encouragement. You begin to write anyway. You don't send it. Not yet. It's just a piece of paper that says, Dear Margaret, I don't know if devotion or mistrust is the right flower for you, but I picked both anyway, just in case. You're still deciding. You fold it twice. Place it beneath the thistle. It feels safe there. Mainstream fact. Victorian love letters were often treated as near-sacred objects stored in ribbon-bound stacks, reread obsessively, even perfumed. There was etiquette around how they were folded, sealed, and delivered. A poorly folded letter could hint at recklessness or disrespect. On the seventh day, the Everly housemaid delivers a letter, not from Emily, from Margaret. It's thin, one sheet, unperfumed. You open it with shaking fingers. It reads, This'll suits you, the coast is gray. Emily is loud. You'd hate the soup. I miss arguing with you over nothing. Yours, possibly. M, you reread it 15 times. Then memorize the curves of her handwriting like geography. You write back. This time you do send it. 2 pages. 1 flower pressed flat inside rosemary. Quirky tidbit. Rosemary symbolized remembrance in the Victorian flower language. It was commonly worn or exchanged at funerals, but also appeared in tokens of longing and romantic fidelity. Shakespeare's Hamlet references it. There's rosemary, that's for remembrance. Your letter says, Margaret. The thistle still hasn't died. Neither has your chair. I sit beside it like a ghost you haven't banished. I remember everything, the joke about time, your dislike for overcooked lamb, how you say horrid with 3 syllables. The rosemary is for that. Write back only if you feel like being remembered too. Yours, definitely. Days pass. No reply. Then, late on the 12th night, another letter arrives. No words, just one pressed bloom. Bluebell. You don't need a dictionary for that. Bluebells mean humility. Or sometimes I'll come back. You place it beside the thistle. And wait. Historians still argue whether silence in the Victorian era was more powerful than speech, if what wasn't said mattered more than what was. Whether folding a flower into paper could carry more honesty than 10 conversations in a drawing room. You're starting to believe it. Margaret returns on a Tuesday. No fanfare. Just appears in the conservatory like she never left. You nearly drop your book. She says nothing at first, walks over to the thistle, taps its side gently. Then, you watered it. You nod. I talk to it too. She raises a brow. That's a bit much. You grin. It never argued. She laughs, then sits. The skirt of her dress brushes your boot. Neither of you move. A long silence. Then she whispers, I didn't write because I was scared I'd say too much. You murmur, I was scared, I'd say too little. Margaret looks at you. I kept thinking about that day. When I said I didn't not want you, you hold your breath. She continues, I think now I do want you. You exhale, not dramatically, not with a flourish, just slowly, like you've been holding it for weeks, because you have. Historians still argue whether romantic restraint was a virtue or a punishment. But sitting beside Margaret, watching her thumb brush lightly against the edge of your sleeve, you think it might have been both, and both is enough. For now, it's official, you're courting. No one says it outright, of course. That would be vulgar. But the signs are all there. You're allowed to visit Margaret on Thursdays now, which is practically a declaration of war in some drawing rooms. And you've been seen walking beside her without gloves. Twice. The tulip is gone from the vase, replaced by a single forget-me-not. A bold little thing for a flower so small. Margaret doesn't comment on it. She just glances at you sideways when you notice. Her lips twitch, but no smile comes. Not yet. You don't press your luck. You sit beside her on the bench and talk about everything that isn't feelings. Cabbages, constellations, why the new butler is obviously stealing biscuits. Margaret nods along, amused, distracted. She fidgets with the hem of her sleeve. Her hands are bare today. You try not to stare, but you fail, and she notices and doesn't pull her sleeve back down. Mainstream fact. In Victorian courtship, ungloved hands were considered shockingly intimate. A man touching a woman's bare hand even briefly was a sign of serious intent. Some etiquette books even classified it as a moment of mutual agreement, akin to an unspoken engagement. After tea, she walks you to the gate. There's no chaperone. Again, this is starting to feel dangerously modern. She pauses before the latch. I might go to Bath next month, she says. You blink. Again, she nods. Mother says the waters are good for the nerves. You smile. Whose nerves? Yours or hers? She doesn't answer. Instead, she says, it's only a few weeks. You nod. I'll write. Margaret tilts her head. And send more flowers, you pretend to consider. Moss. She laughs. Send something that climbs. Ivy, then. Of course. Clings but doesn't suffocate you. Grows upward. You make a mental note. Then she does something unexpected. She touches your hand. Not dramatically, just a light press of fingers against your palm. But still, your pulse betrays you. She lets go before you can fully react, then steps back inside, leaving the scent of rosemary and tea leaves behind her. That night you sit down to write and find yourself struggling, not because you don't know what to say, but because you know exactly what you want to say, and it's too much, too soon. You settle on Margaret. Ivy climbs only where it feels safe. I'm trying to learn from it. If the waters in Bath fail to soothe, imagine me glaring at them for you. Yours, mossily. You add a sprig of ivy, just one, curling like a question mark, quirky tidbit. Ivy was a frequent motif in Victorian jewelry and embroidery. It symbolized fidelity, marriage, and steadfastness. Queen Victoria herself wore ivy-woven designs to memorialize Prince Albert after his death. The weeks before Bath pass like molasses. You fall into a rhythm with Margaret, walks, tea, letters. You argue about book endings and whether tulips are arrogant. You pretend not to notice when she places her hand beside yours on the bench and waits for you to be brave. You never are. Not quite. Until the night before she leaves. She invites you to the garden, not the conservatory, the real garden. Outside, damp grass, moonlight, risk. You hesitate, but go anyway. She's by the stone wall, touching the ivy there. You realize she's waiting, so you do what the ivy does. You climb, not literally. That would be undignified. You walk to her, stand close, then slowly, carefully, you take her hand. She doesn't pull away. She leans just slightly toward you and whispers, "Do you believe in promises?" You say, "Only when they're quiet." She nods, then says, then quietly, "Don't disappear." You tighten your grip, just a little, and reply, "I won't." Historians still argue whether Victorian love was too cautious to count, whether they hesitated themselves into loneliness, whether holding a hand too late was worse than not holding it at all. But right now you know one thing, you're not too late. Not tonight. She's gone. You knew she would be, but that doesn't make the conservatory less empty. The bench feels colder. The violets have finally shriveled. The ivy you brought last week is curling at the edges, still clinging, but barely. You sit anyway. Every Thursday, like it's part of your lungs now. Emily brings you tea, but doesn't stay. You think she's being kind, but it might also be pity. Hard to tell with Emily. Her poker face is legendary among servants and small dogs alike. Margaret's first letter arrives 4 days late. You don't hold it against her. It's 2 pages covered in scribbled ink that trails off at the end like she got distracted, or nervous, or interrupted. She writes about the smell of sulfur near the baths, about a woman who faints every morning at breakfast and is carried out by a footman with impossibly shiny shoes. Then, on the back, in smaller script, the ivy is growing here too. That's it. No signature, no pressed flower, no closure. You press it flat beneath your copy of Persuasion and exhale. It smells faintly of lavender and sea minerals. You write back the same evening. There's a sparrow nesting in the conservatory. I don't think it likes me. That makes 2 of us. Yours likely intimidated by birds. You don't include a flower, just a single feather, found near the windowsill. Margaret replies, 3 days later, "I don't think birds have opinions about you, but if they do, you'll win them over. You're consistent. Ivy always is." Write again. Mainstream fact. The Victorian postal system allowed for multiple deliveries in a single day within cities. Lovers in London could send and receive several letters in 24 hours, enabling near real-time correspondence without ever speaking aloud. You fall into a rhythm of letters. Every other day, Margaret sends sketches now. One of a bent teacup, one of the ivy outside her window, one of a boot, presumably yours, crushing a thistle. You frame that one, not proudly, just honestly. Your letters become more playful. You begin inventing poems, terrible ones, rhyming violet with pilot and pretending it's clever. Margaret responds by sending pressed petals taped to the margins, each one labeled with made-up meanings. Dandelion, impatience, disguised as humility. Crocus small, but suspicious. Hyacinth smells nice, but overthinks everything. You recognize yourself in each. You don't mind. Quirky tidbit. Some Victorian lovers used coded flower alphabets to communicate secret messages in plain sight. Whole letters were constructed using bouquets, each bloom representing a letter or word. It was the original passive-aggressive texting. One morning, you receive no letter, then 2 days, then 5. You write anyway. Margaret, hope you're not imprisoned in some overly perfumed drawing room. If so, blink twice in your next letter. If not, send more suspicious crocuses. Yours, assuming abduction. A week passes. No response. You begin to worry. You consider writing Emily. You even draft the note. Then, late on a stormy Tuesday, a letter finally arrives. But not from Margaret. It's from a physician. A careful, impersonal hand. Margaret fell ill. Nothing fatal, he writes, but enough to keep her in bed away from letters. She requested you be informed discreetly. You read the line 5 times. You sit very still. Then you go to the garden. You pluck a violet, a whole bloom not pressed, and place it on the bench. It's damp from rain, but you don't care. You whisper, "Don't disappear," because you remember her saying it. And now it's your turn to mean it. Historians still argue whether Victorian restraint in love made people stronger or just lonelier. But when you're standing in a room full of wilting plants and unanswered notes, all you know is this restraint feels a lot like waiting, and you're still here, still waiting, because ivy doesn't give up, and neither do you. By the time Margaret writes again, your fingers have memorized the weight of silence. You don't even hear the post arrive. Just find the letter, tucked awkwardly beneath your window pane, like it wanted to sneak in without waking you. It's short, much shorter than before. I didn't vanish, just dissolved for a while. Things still taste like soap, but I think I miss you more than I fear the food. Will you still be there? Thursday M. You fold the note twice. No reply. Not yet. You just go to the conservatory. Sit. Wait. Thursday arrives, and so does she. Wrapped in too many shawls, cheeks paler than usual, eyes with less spark, but there. You don't stand when she enters. She walks to the bench, sits beside you, doesn't speak, doesn't need to. Your hand is already resting palm up between you and hers, finds it without effort, like a promise picked up where it was dropped. Mainstream fact, recovery from illness in the Victorian period was a prolonged and public affair. Convalescence was a social ritual. Families often displayed the progress of the sick through strategic outings, walks, and reappearances in parlors or gardens. You bring nothing with you that day. No flowers, no letters, not even a joke about biscuit theft. Just presence. And Margaret seems grateful for it. She leans her head on your shoulder, sighs, whispers, I missed everything, even the ivy. You smile, even though the ivy's now mostly dead. Later, she laughs when you tell her this. I suppose devotion has a shelf life, she teases. You raise an eyebrow. Or it just needs better gardeners. She chuckles. Do you think we're good gardeners? You look around the withered violets, the dusty tulip vase, the bench with a slight crack in it from weathering. Then, at your hands, still entwined. I think we've gotten good at keeping things alive, even when they shouldn't be. Quirky tidbit. Victorians often exchanged convalescence gifts like hand-sewn sachets, miniature paintings, and lockets containing tea leaves or dried herbs. These tokens were intended to anchor the spirit during recovery, quiet reminders that one's place in the world hadn't vanished. You visit more often after that, not just Thursdays, sometimes Sunday. Sometimes when it rains and you both watch the drops slide down the greenhouse glass like they're racing each other to the edge of the pane. Margaret becomes herself again in pieces. Her voice returns first, then her appetite, particularly for peach tarts, which she insists you learn to make. You fail spectacularly. The crust cracks, the filling leaks, but she eats it anyway, laughing through every bite. You're not good at baking, she declares with mock solemnity. I'm good at sincerity, you counter. She nods. And that's edible, at least. Historians still argue whether Victorian romance was about love or survival, whether the slow build of affection was a symptom of societal constraint or a quiet rebellion against it. But you know this much. You survived the silence. She did too. Now it's something new, something blooming again. One afternoon you find her sitting at the bench alone. You weren't due to visit. She waves a letter in the air. Your handwriting, you blush. She reads aloud, yours assuming abduction. That line made me laugh until my stomach hurt. Emily thought I was having a relapse. You rub the back of your neck. Wasn't meant to be poetic. That's what made it work, she says quietly. Then hands you something. It's a ribbon. Dark green. No words. Just that. You don't ask. Because you know. Victorian engagement rituals often involved symbolic exchanges before official announcements. A woman might give a suitor a ribbon glove or flower as a token of growing affection. It wasn't a proposal. It was an invitation to hope. You tie the ribbon around your wrist later that evening, sleep with it on, wake up and check that it's still there. It is. You feel ridiculous and alive, both at once. That seems to be a theme with Margaret. Spring sharpens. The tulips bloom again, this time uninvited. They arrive in clusters along the outer paths, poking out from gravel, like they've been listening all year and now feel entitled to some screen time. Margaret calls them ambitious. You call them show-offs. The thistle is finally gone, its pot removed its legacy resigned to a smudge of dirt on the shelf. Margaret doesn't mention it, but you see her glance at the empty spot now and then like she's expecting a ghost to fill it. You bring a new plant one day, not a flower, a small vine, honeysuckle. She doesn't say anything for a long time, just kneels next to it, fingers brushing the soft tendrils, watching them search for something to hold on to. It's sticky, she murmurs finally. Devotion with texture, you say. She huffs a laugh. Sounds like a complicated relationship. You grin. Name a good one that isn't. Mainstream fact, honeysuckle, in the Victorian flower language, represented bond of love and was often used in romantic gardens or exchanged between secret admirers. Its clinging nature made it a favorite metaphor for persistent affection. On the fourth Thursday of the month, Margaret arrives with ink stains on her fingertips and a peculiar glow in her eyes. She doesn't sit. Instead, she paces. One turn, two, then three. Finally, she stops in front of you and says, "My mother found our letters." You freeze. "Mine," she clarifies quickly. "The ones you sent." She didn't read them all. Just enough to be alarmed. Alarmed. Margaret shrugs. Apparently, sarcasm isn't becoming of a young lady in recovery. You stare at her. Was it the thistle metaphors or the fig jokes she adds? Silence, then laughter. Yours first, hers following like a dropped pebble in a well. "She thinks we're reckless," Margaret says through the laughter. "She's not wrong. I know." Quirky tidbit. In upper-class Victorian society, intercepted letters could halt courtships altogether. Families, regularly monitored correspondence, and unsuitable tone was grounds for removing a suitor from consideration. Some couples resorted to invisible ink or false names to continue writing. You sit together that day without touching, not because you're afraid, because you're remembering what it felt like not to have that choice. She brushes her fingers against her skirt like she's counting time, then asks, "Would you wait for me?" You blink. She clarifies, "If I had to go away, if things shifted." Would you wait? You want to say yes immediately, but instead you look at her, really, look, at the way she's twisting her necklace chain around her thumb, at the crease forming between her brows, at the quiet way she's bracing herself, already preparing for disappointment. You reach over and untwist the chain gently. "Say I've been waiting since we met, Margaret. I didn't know what for, but it was you." Historians still argue whether Victorian lovers were overly dramatic or just constrained by the rules of their time, whether every whispered promise was real or just the only option available when you couldn't speak freely. But Margaret is quiet now, not because she's unsure, because she's holding the moment in her teeth like a fragile thread. And then she lets it out. "I'm not leaving," she says. "Not yet." Your shoulders release tension you didn't even know you were carrying. But she continues, "I need time, space. There's something I want to do before we get too comfortable." You nod. "Wait," and finally ask, What? She smiles. Mischievous. Dangerous. I want to learn how to be selfish. You blink. What does that mean? Margaret leans close, brushes a kiss not on your lips, but on your wrist where the ribbon still is, and says, it means I'll choose us. But I want to know that I'm not doing it just to make everyone else happy. You exhale slowly. I can wait for that. She touches your cheek. Good. Because I think I'm worth waiting for. You laugh. You definitely are. And the honeysuckle grows a little taller behind you, reaching skyward with reckless optimism. You don't see Margaret for 12 days. Not because she's unwell, not because her mother has locked her away, not because of a family scandal involving a misplaced monocle or an unfortunate pheasant. She's simply elsewhere, not in location but in practice. She sends no letters, leaves no pressed flowers, doesn't walk through the garden path or appear near the conservatory bench. You start to notice the bench more than usual, how the sun hits it differently each hour, how a thin crack has formed along one leg, possibly from winter frost. You think about fixing it, but somehow that feels like overstepping. So you wait. You write a letter, but don't send it. You buy flowers, but leave them unwrapped. You visit the honeysuckle and speak to it out loud. And then, on the 13th day, Margaret arrives. No fanfare, no lace gloves, no explanations. She's wearing her walking boots and a green coat that doesn't match her bonnet. You nearly don't recognize her. She notices and smiles. That's the point, she says softly. Mainstream fact. In the later Victorian era, especially among the more liberal circles, women began experimenting with more practical fashion as a subtle rebellion, ditching corsets, opting for walking suits or mismatched accessories. It was fashion as self-permission. Margaret sits on the bench like she owns it, crosses one leg over the other, hands in her lap, no chaperone in sight. You sit beside her cautious, not because you're afraid of her, but because she's no longer the girl you thought you were courting. She's something else now. She speaks first. I spent the last week walking, alone, through town, through the fields. I visited the bakery and didn't ask anyone what I should order. You blink. Was the world all right with that? Mostly, she replies. The baker gave me 2 scones instead of 1. I think he approved. You smile, trying to match her ease, but your throat's dry. She notices, says nothing, just reaches into her coat and pulls out something small. Your old letter, the one about fig theft and sarcasm and the missing thistle. It's been folded and unfolded so many times it's beginning to tear. She hands it to you gently, then says, I want to choose joy. You blink. Are we joy? She shrugs. Some days were ivy and thistles and overcooked pastries. You smirk, but mostly joy. She nods, mostly. Quirky tidbit Victorians were obsessed with melancholy as refinement. Many believed true love required suffering, delayed gratification, and endless yearning. Joyful couples were seen as frivolous, even unserious. You want to say something poetic, something Margaret might sew into her coat lining or quote under her breath while waiting for tea. But all you manage is, "I missed you." She grins. "You miss the way I criticize your handwriting." "That too. And how I interrupt your theories about birds having feelings, especially that." Margaret stands suddenly, turns to you with a hand outstretched. "Walk with me." You take it. She doesn't let go. You don't ask where you're going. It doesn't matter. Because every step is a quiet agreement. A wordless rewrite of what this courtship was always going to be. Not something arranged or permitted. Not a checklist of exchanged glances and florally coded messages. Just two people, matching stride, choosing each other. Historians still argue whether Victorian romances were real or role play, whether lovers loved each other or the idea of love more. But in that moment, you know one thing. Margaret isn't performing. She's not reciting lines or quoting books. She's walking, fast, then slow, letting her fingers trail the edge of the brick wall, glancing sideways just to catch your expression, laughing when you catch hers first. It's not dramatic, it's not tragic, it's not even polite, it's simply true. And you think maybe truth is enough, even in a century built on performance. The wedding is not announced, not because it's a secret, though Margaret delights in telling people it's a scandal, but because it simply happens. One afternoon, she brings you to the greenhouse and places a folded envelope in your hand. Inside, a pressed crocus, a sketch of the bench where you first held hands, and a note that says simply, "Saturday, noon. Garden shoes optional, but encouraged. M." You laugh when you read it, then reread it, then check the date 3 times just in case this is some kind of riddle. It's not. It's just Margaret. And this is just happening. Mainstream fact. In late Victorian England, civil weddings became more acceptable among certain social classes. Though formal church ceremonies were still the norm, a quiet garden affair, particularly among artists and progressives, signaled a shift toward personal authenticity over public pageantry. You don't tell anyone but Emily. She nods, says nothing, and hands you a handkerchief embroidered with 2 terribly lopsided hearts. It's unclear whether she made it or confiscated it from a sentimental tradesman. Saturday arrives gray but dry. Margaret wears blue, not pastel, not powder, but a blue so deep it borders on defiant. Her boots are muddy by the time she reaches the ivy trellis, and her veil is nowhere to be seen. You're not wearing a cravat, just a ribbon around your wrist. Still green, still there. Margaret notices. She smiles. No vows, no readings, just the 2 of you and a registrar who mispronounces both your names, then apologizes and starts again. You both laugh. Halfway through, Margaret's hands are cold. Yours are shaking. Somewhere in the garden, a bird screeches at the wrong moment. You think it's perfect. Quirky tidbit. Some Victorian couples exchanged tree saplings instead of rings during unconventional weddings, planting them together as a symbol of shared growth. A few even returned years later to see which grew taller. Sometimes it was the honeysuckle. Afterward, you sit on the conservatory bench again. Margaret tucks her feet beneath her skirt, still holding your hand like it's something delicate but not breakable. You don't talk about the future. You just talk. About the bread being too dry. About the tulips insisting on blooming near the gooseberries. About how the bench will probably collapse one day from sheer emotional weight. She places her head on your shoulder and says, "We did it." You nod. Then say, "What did we do?" She shrugs. Survived a whole season of terrible metaphors and societal pressure, and my mother, and Emily's opinions on your handwriting. You chuckle. It's practically a novel, this relationship. She lifts her head, looks at you directly. It's ours. Historians still argue whether non-traditional Victorian unions held the same weight as sanctioned ones, whether love without the lace was valid, whether muddy boots and no veil counted as commitment. But you don't care, because the ivy's blooming again, the thistle is still gone, and Margaret is here, not in secret, not in theory, in full color, with crooked sketches and dried flowers and boots that need cleaning. That evening, as dusk settles, you walk her home. No carriage, just the two of you and a long dirt path. When you reach the gate, she doesn't let go of your hand, just turns slightly and whispers, "You'll stay tonight." You hesitate out of habit, then say, "Yes," because this story doesn't need suspense anymore. It's not about what might happen. It's about what is. And what is right now is simple. You, Margaret, the quiet hum of a world that finally said yes. You wake up early, not because something startles you, but because the house is unusually still. Margaret is already up. You hear the soft scrape of a chair against floorboards, the clink of a spoon in a teacup, the kind of quiet noises that feel louder in a house that's learning to hold two people instead of one. When you reach the kitchen, she's halfway through a book, barefoot, and dunking a sugar biscuit into her tea with grim precision. "You didn't boil the water too long," she says, not looking up. Progress. You sit beside her and try not to knock over the sugar bowl. It's surprisingly difficult. Everything feels new, or perhaps newly permanent. She finally glances up and smiles. "We're boring now," she says. You raise an eyebrow. "That fast?" She nods. "I've read your letters. Married you in a muddy garden. And now we're here, eating breakfast in silence. Textbook boredom." You reach for her hand. She doesn't flinch. You kiss her fingers. "We should write a guidebook." Mainstream fact. In the Victorian era, the idea of companionate marriage, based on emotional connection and mutual respect, began gaining traction, especially among liberal thinkers. Though rare, some couples prioritized conversation and shared habits over traditional roles and expectations. After breakfast, you return to the conservatory. Margaret insists on sweeping the path herself. She claims it's meditative. You suspect it's because she doesn't trust you not to decapitate the tulips. You water the honeysuckle. It's taller now, curling along the trellis you installed last month. You catch Margaret watching you and pretending not to. She's carrying a book titled Dramatic Poetry of Forgotten Women. You ask if she plans to quote it at you during arguments. She says, "Only if you deserve it." You laugh. She doesn't. Then she grins. Quirky tidbit Victorian women often kept argument diaries, journals, not of grievances, but witty comebacks they wished they'd used. Some entries were written days or weeks after the disagreement. Entire volumes of these have been discovered in attics and trunks. You walk to town together later, holding hands, no gloves. People stare, not scandalized, just surprised. At the bookshop, Margaret buys ink and a small journal with gold trim. You buy licorice, even though you hate it. She eats all of it on the way home. At one point, she stops walking, turns to you, says, "Do you think we'll still laugh when we're gray?" You pretend to study her face seriously. "I think we'll laugh harder, but slower." You know, out of breath. She nods, satisfied, then says, "What if I forget?" "Forget what?" "That this is good, that it's real." You pause, then take the ribbon from your wrist and place it gently in her pocket. She looks down. "You'll remember," you say, "or I'll remind you." She kisses you, right there, in the middle of the lane. Two old women gasp from a window. You both laugh, then keep walking. Historians still argue whether Victorian marriage was performance or partnership, whether love lasted because of duty or despite it, whether anyone ever truly felt seen beneath the layers of etiquette and obligation. But here, with Margaret's hand in yours, you feel seen completely, even when she steals your tea biscuit without asking, especially then. That evening, the garden is quiet. You sit beneath the ivy. The bench is creaking again. Margaret calls it seasonal honesty. You rest your head on her lap, eyes closed, as she reads aloud from her dramatic poetry book. The poem is about a woman who plants garlic instead of roses and is misunderstood forever. You say, maybe she just liked garlic. Margaret strokes your hair and replies, or maybe she wanted something that grew under the surface. You fall asleep like that and dream of thistles turning into honeysuckle. It rains for a week. Not the dramatic kind with thunderclaps and poetic lightning strikes, but the sort of steady, indecisive drizzle that feels like the sky is thinking something over. Margaret hates it, mostly because the honeysuckle sulks and the bench becomes unusable without inviting mildew. You spend more time indoors. She reorganizes her poetry books by mood instead of author. You start drafting letters. You'll never send notes to the Thistle updates. For a younger version of yourself, a formal complaint to the person who invented corset hooks. On day 3, Margaret bursts into the study with a soaked bonnet, 3 dripping letters, and a triumphant grin. "I ran into Emily," she says breathlessly. You stare at her bonnet, which is shedding water onto the rug like a very damp dog. "She's married," she continues. You blink. She married a librarian. Now you really blink. And she named her cat Thistle. You laugh. Poetic justice. Margaret nods. It's already bitten 3 people. Mainstream fact. In late Victorian England, spinsterhood became less stigmatized for women with social standing and income. Friendships among single women and former rivals often evolved into deeply loyal social circles, sometimes called Boston marriages, if they live together platonically. The storm keeps you inside. So, you build a habit. Every evening at 6, Margaret lights a single lamp in the corner and reads aloud. Not poems, not letters, not even scandalous serialized novels, cookbooks, Victorian cookbooks. She reads them in a tone dripping with mock seduction. Add 1 tablespoon of marrow and stir precisely 7 times. Clockwise, she purrs. You laugh so hard, once you choke on a peppermint. It becomes your favorite hour of the day. Quirky tidbit. Many Victorian women collected and exchanged recipes as a coded form of intimacy. Hidden in harmless roast duck instructions were references to suitors, shared secrets, and passive-aggressive notes about other women's gravy. On the 7th day, the rain stops. The air smells like wet stone and chimney smoke. Margaret insists on inspecting the garden immediately, armed with a teacup and stubborn optimism. The honeysuckle survived. The tulips sulk but endure. You both sit on the damp bench, ignoring the fact that it squelches audibly beneath you. Margaret holds your hand with a wet glove and says, "We should host a dinner." You raise an eyebrow. She's never hosted anything more complicated than a sarcastic tea. "I'll cook," she continues. You stare at her. She nods seriously. "I read all about veal jelly and tripe soup. I feel ready." You gently remove the teacup from her hand. "Maybe we start with bread." "Fine," she mutters, "but I'm adding marrow." You groan. She grins. Historians still argue whether Victorian domesticity was weaponized serenity or a quiet form of revolution. Whether women found agency in cookery, or whether cookbooks were just another cage, gilded with clotted cream. Margaret thinks the truth lies in intention. If she cooks because she wants to, it's art. If she cooks because she must, it's prison. You suspect she'll keep choosing art, even if the pudding always ends up slightly scorched. Later that night, the sky clears. You open the windows. She reads you a recipe for sponge cake that accidentally quotes Lord Byron. You light the lamp early. The thistle doesn't return, but its ghost is oddly quiet. Margaret says it's moved on. You think it's just listening. Spring sneaks in like it's not sure it was invited. One morning, the ivy has tiny buds. The next, the tulips throw color at the sky like they're performing an apology for winter. The bench dries out completely and creaks as if it's missed being part of conversations. Margaret insists on breakfast in the garden. You protest mildly. She says, "You married me for my optimism." You remind her you married her despite it. She kisses your nose and brings out mismatched cups. No table, just knees and grass and toast that lands butter side down. Somehow, it's perfect. Mainstream fact, Victorian breakfasts in upper-middle-class homes often occurred in the garden during spring and summer, particularly among the artistic and liberal circles. It was believed the fresh air improved digestion and one's temperament of the spirit. You develop a routine. Margaret waters. You prune. She hums a tune that she never finishes. You finish it. She scowls and starts over. You never win. At least, not in song. The days stretch. Letters come and go, some from Emily, some from former suitors who clearly didn't get the memo. Margaret shows you one, smirks, then uses it to clean her boots. You ask if she's sure she wants to stay in one place. She glances up from a dirt-smudged trowel and says, "With you." Yes, quirky tidbit. Some Victorian couples wrote private constitution documents outlining household duties, dispute resolutions, and even weekly emotional check-ins. These proto-relationship contracts were hidden in drawers or behind bookcases, only discovered decades later in estate clearances. You try to write one together, just for fun. Margaret insists Article 1 should be no metaphors before breakfast. You counter with no quoting obscure poets after 10 p.m. You both agree that honeysuckle disputes will be settled via rock, paper, scissors. By the time it's done, it's 6 pages long and includes a clause about marmalade ownership. She tucks it into the back of her dramatic poetry book. Future historians will be very confused, she says. They'll argue over the marmalade. Good. Later, she finds a turtle in the garden, names it Lord Weatherby. You ask if she plans to keep it. She says he's clearly lived here longer than we have. Lord Weatherby becomes part of the routine. He eats strawberries and naps beneath the gooseberry bush. Margaret builds him a miniature gazebo from broken flower pots. You declare it absurd. She names it Weatherby Manor. You secretly fix one of its columns when she's not looking. Historians still argue whether Victorian domestic life was about appearance or intimacy, whether couples like you and Margaret truly lived together or simply near each other, tethered by duty. But here, with strawberry-stained fingers and a turtle named after a disgraced parliamentarian, it feels very much like with. One afternoon, a neighbor stops by, Mrs. Hargrave, widow, a hawk in petticoats. She peers at your muddy boots and Margaret's sun-streaked hair and says, unconventional but not unpleasant. You thank her. She hands you a pie. Margaret bows sarcastically. Mrs. Hargrave pretends not to smirk. Later, you eat the pie and declare it alarmingly good. Margaret says, "We're in, officially." "In what? The village," she says. "You mean society?" "No," she whispers. "Something better." That night she lights the garden lanterns, tiny things, warm, winking orbs. You sit on the bench, hands touching, just enough. Margaret leans in. "I don't want everything to change," she says. You look around, at the ivy, at the bench, at Weatherby snoring. It doesn't have to. She nods. "Let's grow slow," she says. You agree. And for once don't need to write it down. You don't remember what day it is. Not because anything's wrong, but because everything feels rhythmically right. Margaret starts humming again in the mornings. This time she lets you finish the tune. You wake up before her sometimes, just to look, not creepily, reverently, like watching a cathedral exhale. The bench still holding up now leans slightly to the left. You both refuse to fix it. Margaret says it's the only thing in this house allowed to grow old without protest. You agree. The ivy stretches across the trellis like it's telling time. You stop counting days. You start naming them. Mainstream fact Victorians had specific names for each day of the week in the domestic routine. Washing day, baking day, visiting day, and so on. Some couples adopted private names, Quiet Tuesday, Scone Thursday, to reclaim time from the rigidity of social schedules. You call Wednesday Listening Day. It means no opinions, just ears. Margaret thrives. You struggle. Fridays are librarian walks, a nod to Emily's romantic choices. You visit the village library together, check out obscure cookbooks. Then, try to cook page 47 that night, regardless of the recipe. You once had boiled eel soup. You do not speak of that day. Saturday is bench hour. 1 hour. No interruptions. No guests. No chores. Just sitting together on that ever-sinking bench. It creaks louder each week. You both pretend not to notice. Quirky tidbit. Some Victorian couples had informal rituals called invisible anniversaries, not tied to weddings or birthdays, but the first time they met, or first argued about chairs, or first shared silence without discomfort. These micro-celebrations helped anchor affection in the mundane. Your invisible anniversary is the day the thistle disappeared. You celebrate with shortbread and silence. Margaret finds a tiny silver thistle charm at the market and strings it around your teacup like a joke. But she never removes it. You smile every time you sip. The symbolism is too obvious to mention. She knows. You know. That's enough. A letter arrives from Emily. She's moved again. The cat is thriving. She includes a recipe for marrow and ginger pudding with a note. Try it. Suffer. Bond. Margaret howls. You bake it. It's terrible. You both eat it anyway. You call that Sunday. Historians still argue whether Victorian affection was buried under social etiquette or quietly flourishing in private rituals, whether lovers told each other the truth or simply coated it in jam jars and handkerchiefs. You believe the truth was always there, soft, repetitive, like ivy curling toward light. Margaret paints again, watercolors on old receipts. She claims canvases are pretentious. She draws Weatherby, wearing a monocle and holding a scroll labeled property rights. You frame it. She lets you. You build a shelf for her paints. It wobbles. She calls it charmingly slanted. You let her. That evening she pulls out your original letters. Some are smudged beyond repair. Others still smell like pressed thyme and ink. She reads one aloud. The one about how you didn't believe in love until someone argued with you about thistle etiquette and wore boots in the conservatory. You both go quiet after that. Margaret closes the envelope carefully, then says, If we had met differently, you interrupt. I wouldn't have liked you. She raises an eyebrow. I would have adored you. She smirks, backpedaling, noted. You kiss her hand, then the air, then nothing. Because the moment doesn't need punctuation. It just needs staying, and you're still here. Summer settles in with the subtlety of a brass band. The garden erupts. Ivy climbs faster than you can guide it. Tulips stretch until they topple, and the honeysuckle finally wins its silent war with the fence. Everything smells like mint and sun-warmed dirt. Margaret starts sleeping with the windows open. She claims it's for the breeze. You suspect it's because she likes waking to birdsong, even when the birds are objectively terrible singers. You both get sunburnt the first weekend of July. Matching, symmetrical, romantic, if itchy. She draws your freckles in ink. You dot her collarbone with tiny ice cubes. It becomes a game who can be more casually dramatic before lunch. Mainstream fact, by the late 1800s, Victorians began embracing natural health, sunlight, fresh air garden walks as remedies to the nervous maladies of urban life. Couples often spent early mornings or evenings together outside, favoring gardens over drawing rooms. You take your tea outdoors now, even when it's too hot. Margaret wears a wide-brimmed straw hat and absolutely refuses to remove it. She claims it makes her feel like an empress. You call her your majesty until she throws a spoon at you. You install a hammock. It breaks. You rebuild it together very badly. It lists hard to the left, and both of you fall out 3 times. You refuse to fix it anymore. It becomes a metaphor. Some things just lean, she says. You agree, and hang fairy lights around it. Quirky tidbit hammocks appeared in some Victorian gardens as part of the aesthetic movement, not for rest, but for display. The right hammock, draped in imported fabrics, was considered a statement of cultured idleness. Few people actually sat in them. Most feared collapse. You sit in yours every day. You read cookbooks. She reads travelogues about places you'll likely never visit, not because you can't, but because the garden feels like its own country now. You rename the beds. The northeast corner becomes North Weatherby. The gooseberry bush is its own duchy. Lord Weatherby, still living slightly fatter, now rules a 5-inch radius and growls when pigeons land too close. Margaret documents it all in a sketchbook titled The Not-So-Lonely Empire. You consider submitting it to the town paper. She forbids it. You do it anyway. It becomes a local favorite. Historians still argue whether Victorians believed in quiet contentment or if they simply endured it, whether a peaceful afternoon in the sun was bliss or boredom, whether love, when no longer dramatic, became invisible. But here now, under a lopsided hammock and the hum of late July, nothing feels invisible. Not the way Margaret glances at you when she thinks you're asleep. Not the way your hands find hers without effort. Not the way Weatherby blinks slowly like a tiny green priest, giving you his blessing. That night, Margaret surprises you with a cake. Burnt edges, too much nutmeg, You eat it all anyway. She smiles. Later, she pulls out the old letter you wrote, yes, that one, the ridiculous, rambling one, and reads it back to you. You cringe, then blush, then cry a little. She doesn't tease. She just takes your hand, places it on her heart. You didn't know it yet, she whispers, but you already chose me. You nod, because it's true, and you did. The bench creaks, the ivy climbs, the stars spill. Everything's still growing. So are you. So is she. Together. Always. The garden quiets long before you do. Above the ivy, the last light of day lingers like a whisper, soft, golden, and in no hurry to leave. The tulips fold inward, resting their bright faces in the dark. Even Weatherby seems subdued, nestled under his gooseberry bush, as still as a stone that dreams. The air is warm now, but gentle. It wraps around your shoulders like an old friend. You and Margaret sit close, not because you need to, but because you want to. The kind of closeness that says, I know you, and I choose you, still. No one speaks. There's no need. The bench sighs beneath your weight, a sound so familiar now, it's become part of the evening itself. The kind of creak that doesn't call attention, only marks time. You lean your head back and let your breath match the rhythm of the leaves above you. Slower now, deeper, each inhale softer than the last. A breeze lifts the edge of her shawl, carrying with it the faint scent of thyme and tea leaves. She doesn't move, just smiles. You watch her profile in the twilight and think, if this is what forgetting the world feels like, let the world forget you right back. You close your eyes. The wind hums. The garden listens. And in this moment, this gentle, golden, almost silent, now everything is still growing, but you can rest. Sleep well.